we're back here in Kokomlemle to still do some discussion before we link up again with them in Parliament. And I'm still here with Henry Kyeremeh. He is an analyst, financial analyst, and we'll still be delving into some critical issues concerning the budget and looking at how we can move this country forward when it comes to issues relating to revenue and industrialization and all of that. Henry, when we were listening to the rest of the team, one of the things we were discussing was growth. 7.9 growth. Majority of it is, I'll call it artificial, oil growth. Is that not worrying? I mean, since oil has a lifespan, and it looks like agriculture, for example, that used to be the main driver of this economy, has dropped significantly to third position. Does that worry you?
I mean, it's a worry, and many countries that discovers oil, often you have this trap where you begin to focus more on oil at the detriment of other sectors of the economy. But often we also talk about the fact that the structure of the economy hasn't changed. The fact that you still depend on cocoa is a problem. But you necessarily don't have to change the structure. What you need to do is to add value to the one that you have comparative advantage over. And we have a comparative advantage in production of cocoa.
That's right.
Perhaps what we have not done was to add value and then take advantage of the value chain system to make sure we build industry within the cocoa value chain and then use that as a pillar for the growth of our country. What perhaps you also need to look at if you're talking about economic growth is that what is the major constraint to growth in Ghana? We seem to be doing what I call the spray gun approach in terms of policy thinking, where you sprinkle a lot of policies in the budget and try to touch every aspect of the economy. In doing that, you're not going to have the growth that you expect. You need to specifically target the major constraints to the economy. Is it about innovation? Is it about the infrastructure? And in my opinion, I think innovation is critical if we want to have the growth and have a sustainable growth that we all desire as a country. We need to think about innovation, we need to think about technology, we need to think about science, because that is where we can manage the catch-up that we all want to have as a country.
Government actually reduced its spending in area of industry by as much as 31%, but industry actually also grew the largest by 17.7%. Should this budget be shifting its resources, for example, to the industry sector, because that is actually the growth driver currently?
You hit it right on the nail. I think that our focus should be on industrialization, and the 2017 budget had a couple of very good policies that looks at industrialization, and I think the Ghana Export Promotion Council should be up and doing. It needs to bring in a lot of foreign direct investment. You also have the free zones working. There's a need for us to bring in a lot of investments into the sectors that are struggling, the textile industry. You know, food processing industry. That is where growth occurs. When you put in money in those areas, that is where growth occurs. And I'm a very big fan of the National Entrepreneurship and Innovation Program. In my hunch is that is where our growth will come from, because it's linking up three very important sectors. You have the education sector, you have industry, and government. So that policy, should we continue to invest in it? In my opinion, I think that is where the growth, and that is where I think our growth as a country hinges.
It means that you're looking at government increasing the seed money from 10 million to some more.
Very much so. There is a need for us to put in much money, because that linkage mechanism where academia can advise on some of the things that we are doing, and bear in mind they are focused on innovation, it's quite critical for our growth. Without innovation, without technology, without science, we are not likely to have a sustainable growth. And for me, NEIP becomes a very important tool in propelling growth and having that growth sustained over a period of time.
Let's take a look at the recent last year's tax new taxes that were introduced, and of course the issue relating to the VAT that was separated and how the impact has gone so far. So Deloitte and Touche has actually brought us some figures on the taxes. Let's go over them right now. The personal income tax band for residents individuals have been revised to include additional bands for monthly chargeable income exceeding 10,000 to be taxed at a rate of 35%. This is on increase from the previous top marginal rate of 25% on monthly income. So people earning 10,000 cedis and above were supposed to be paying more. So Henry, this talks about your rich category. At least the Minister of Finance has clearly told you who is rich and why they must be paying more. And so that was one of the areas that the new tax system took a look at. And then obviously they also took a look at the luxury vehicle tax, which indicated that if your car was doing some 2.9 and above, you were actually going to pay more of that. So the introduction of the Luxury Vehicle Tax Act 969, government has also introduced the luxury vehicle levy on motor vehicles that with engine capacity of 2.950 cc and above, commercial vehicles for goods and transport, or with a capacity to transport more than 10 persons was also one of the things. So I'm thinking that this government has had so much money at its disposal. This has raked in quite an amount, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, in terms of the tax measures, there are a couple of very innovative tax measures that were introduced by government. However, the actual numbers in terms of revenue mobilization is not corresponding to some of these measures. There had been a couple of teething problems with the implementation of some of these measures, and there is a need for us to relook at them and see how we can address some of these teething problems. It still hasn't addressed the problem of a narrow tax net. Okay. There is still a sizable number of Ghanaians who are outside the tax system, and the people who are already in the system seems to be paying more. And we talked about it in offline when we're offset. So there is a need for us to look at systems where we can bring everybody into the tax bracket. It is quite critical, broaden the tax bracket to ensure that...
And you're talking about how we can formalize the economy.
Sure, and formalize the economy, modernize the economy. The informal sector, the underground economy, we call it, the underground economy, needs to be brought to bear, and then ensure that whoever operates within such an economy is brought on board so that he or she can pay tax that is needed for development.
I think one of the most controversial was the restructuring of the VAT Act 970, 971, and 972, the VAT and National Health Insurance Levy regime, which previously allowed for input VAT claim, or both VAT and NHIL, has been restructured. The restructuring revises the standard VAT rate from 15% to some 12.5%. The Ghana Education Trust Fund levy of 2.5%, which was hitherto part of the 15% VAT, has now been made a separate straight levy. That was the bone of contention, the straight levy that was being charged. Currently, people in the beverages sector said, look, they were going to increase their prices because then this has kicked in, the separation has kicked in. Maybe you could explain that further, so that if somebody was a continuous consumer of alcoholic beverages or some beverages, for example, they should be ready to be paying more.
Yes, it's true. I mean, what government did was to decouple the NHIS from the VAT. So effectively, you're going to pay more by the introduction of that very decoupling process. What we also need to realize that we need taxes to develop. Many of us are very much outraged about borrowing and putting a lot of pressure on future generation. It means that we must begin to spend what we have And how do you get money to spend? You can only get money to spend when you go about taxing people, you go about mobilizing domestically some of the resources that you need to develop. So it was a technical process. It was a technical process that allowed government to rip in a couple million of cedis to help it do most of the programs that it had planned to do.
So it wasn't a tax reduction after all.
Technically speaking, it wasn't a tax reduction because when you decouple them, it means that on the face of it, it's 100%. Once you decouple it, even if it's a 1%, on the face of it, it's 100% tax. And that is exactly what they did. They decouple it, and then it's applicable to the principal amount. So if I'm spending 100 cedis, 2.5% will be applied on the 100 cedis, and the 12.5% will be applied on the same 100 cedis. So if you do the math,
actually raking more money.
Yes, you're raking more money for the government, and the consumer has to pay more. But like I always say, you can't eat your chicken. You can't eat your eggs and have, So you need to begin to think about the fact that this country needs to develop. And how do you develop? Do we continue borrowing and create problem for future generation, or there's a need for us to start thinking about being innovative in generating more resources to embark on many of the infrastructure gaps that Aviji was talking about.
You remember that some of the tax holidays that actually, or tax breaks that were given to certain groups of people included the private universities, included also people who were starting up businesses under the NEEP, the National Entrepreneurship and Innovation Program, which was actually, if you were 36 years and below and you were starting a business, you could have some tax break. Has this kicked in yet, especially when it comes to young people who were really going to start a business?
Yeah, I think so. I think I've seen a couple of very innovative programs. I've seen incubator farming in some part of the country ongoing at the moment. We need to deepen it. The scale of it, for me, it's small. There is a need for us to, and like I said, government should see it as a big project.
That's right.
Put in the necessary resources. Because you see, the younger generation has technology, it has innovation, and it has knowledge. So combining this, and we live in a big data world, where data becomes very important. Many of them are able to connect people who need the services. So, and that linkage thing is already in the NIP. And I think that should we put in more money and allow these young people to be innovative and to come out with solutions to many of the problems we have, it would become a very good platform to spring us up into the promised land that we are all looking up to. So I think the tax breaks is quite important. But again, it will also mean that it will hit your revenue. So there's a trade-off that you have to come to terms with.
There was a young lady I spoke with about 3 days ago who is a painter. She actually paints rooms, and she's just 20 years. And she said, look, she was expecting that government should concentrate a lot more on people with talent and skills, because then they already have the talent. It just needs to be polished up a bit, and then they are just ready to go into the market. But this group of people seem to have been left behind, and it looks like all government's concentration is on the area of education, and not people with skills and abilities. But let's move the conversation forward to the free SHS and my issue of how these students are going to be absorbed after they are done with SS, the university. Have we prepared enough? And I was just having a conversation with you in relation to the tax breaks that we're giving to some, private universities. Was that the trick to actually prepare other institutions for these huge numbers that are likely to kick in 2 years?
Yes, I think government would never be very much prepared. Preparation is always in progress. And I think that there is a need for us to think about this problem seriously, because the numbers are going to be huge, and the private university will become a very big player going forward. And looking at the challenges many of these private universities are facing currently, there is the need for government to give them the leveraging capacity, give them room to be able to be sustaining until such a point that the numbers that they require to be self-sustaining, increases. So I think giving them tax breaks would give them that room to be able to operate until such a point that, when the numbers, the free SHS numbers are there, they can absorb them, and then they will be self-sustaining going forward. So anything that government needs to do to ensure that the private universities are not going to collapse, in my opinion,
critical.
is
Okay,
critical.
so let's cross over to Parliament again, where Kojo Yankson is standing by with Joe Jackson, businessman and COO of Dalex Finance, and Dr. Sapon Smart. He is a Senior Research Fellow, Institute of Research, Innovation and Development. Kojo, if your team is ready, please take it over.